biblical prohibition to reprove your fellow is introduced by the prohibition against hating your kin in your heart, and appears immediately before the famous commandment to love your neighbor as yourself.
How do these intense emotions inform our confrontation of others? In this video, we'll examine texts from two ancient Jewish communities, the Dead Sea Scrolls from the Qumran sectarians, and the Gospel of Matthew from the early followers of Jesus.
If you're wondering why the Gospel of Matthew is so Jewish and part of our discussion, check out my other video series on the Sermon on the Mount in light of early Jewish sources.
The Dead Sea Scrolls and the Gospels both interpret the biblical obligation to reprove your fellow in light of the emotions of hate and love, but they offer us dramatically different takes on what it means to confront another person.
One of the many scrolls found in the caves of Qumran has come to be known as the community rule, or rule of the community. This important text sets out the foundational laws for those living in this secluded group. The community rule teaches that members of the sect should rebuke one another in truth, humility, and merciful love. So this work reads Leviticus 19:18's commandment to love as an instruction for the proper performance of Leviticus 19:17's commandment to rebuke. But surprisingly, this rule limits rebuke to those of the sect alone. But one must not rebuke nor quarrel with the men of the pit, that is, anyone outside the community. One must rebuke with true knowledge and righteous judgment only with the chosen of the way.
Why does the Dead Sea Scroll community limit reproof to those within their group? We might expect them to be most interested in confronting people outside of their sect, who they see as erring in so many ways. The answer appears at the very outset of the community rule.
Toward the beginning of this work, the instructor is commanded to teach the community both to love all the children of light, that is to say other members of the group, and to hate all the children of darkness, or those who are outside the community, each commensurate with his guilt and the vengeance due him from God.
This split between insiders and outsiders is a running theme throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here, the community rule aligns love and rebuke for those in the group, in contrast to hate and God's vengeance, which it associates with those outside the group.
Looking back at our two biblical verses from Leviticus, we can see how the community rule aligns the first part of each verse about hatred and vengeance to apply to outsiders, while the middle of each verse, including the commandments to rebuke and love, applied to insiders.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls offer us a way for understanding the relationship between the commandment to rebuke and the intense emotions mentioned nearby. You lovingly rebuke your peers, but you hate and ignore those outside the group.
A very different approach to this issue appears in the Gospel of Matthew.
The Gospel of Matthew generally opposes confronting others.
For example, in chapter 7, Jesus is presented as saying, "Do not judge, so that you may not be judged." And he goes on to say, "Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' while the log is in your own eye?"
This parable suggests that one should consider their own faults before confronting others about theirs. Elsewhere, Matthew recommends a loving response to acts that most would consider worthy of rebuke.
In chapter 5, Jesus recommends that you do not resist an evildoer, but if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. He goes on to say that you should love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you.
In these passages, Jesus is portrayed as rejecting retaliation against others, recommending love rather than rebuke.
So in contrast to the community rule, which applies hate and vengeance to outsiders and rebuke and love to insiders, the Gospel of Matthew sees the commandment of love as overshadowing everything, and even rejecting hatred, vengeance, and rebuke.
In this video, we've encountered two very different works that engage with the issue of confronting others for wrongdoing.
The community rule from the Dead Sea Scrolls encourages rebuking one's peers with love and refraining from reproving those outside of the community, while the Gospel of Matthew rejects rebuke entirely, setting it up as the undesired antithesis of love.
In the next video, we'll see how slander impacts the understanding of rebuke in wisdom sources from Jewish antiquity.